Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at how to build an Eldar melee army in Pariah Nexus. So Eldar melee, from the beginning of the edition, has been something of contention for Eldar players. We're kind of used to, in past editions, really strong aspect warriors that can just annihilate squads of Marines like no other. However, since the arrival of 10th edition, we've actually seen a slight change in the way aspect warriors operate, especially that of the melee aspects. Howling Banshees, once known to be able to kill vehicles in close combat, are now only relegated to being able to kill heavy infantry, things like Marines. Striking Scorpions are still very powerful, however, but they are a little bit weaker than their previous iterations. Having said that, a lot of the aspect warriors, especially the melee ones, have had their costs reduced considerably since the last balanced data slate. In fact, if you look at their points costs last edition and 9th, some of the units have decreased almost by half, which is very considerable. Now, in Pariah Nexus, we have seen the rise of melee armies, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Orcs. We're seeing all of these armies do very well, especially Dark Eldar, right? Their win rates are soaring. They're doing very well in competitive play. And in fact, they're doing very well in casual play too, typically because they are easy to manage as an army. And they basically do one thing really well, which is get into combat with you and wreck your day. And there's not a lot that, players can do about it if they're not prepared for it. However, after I made that video about how to counter melee armies, I got to thinking, is it possible for the Aeldari to run a successful and powerful melee army themselves? And I ended up coming to the conclusion that yes, indeed, I think the Aeldari can in fact field an effective melee army that may actually be able to rival other factions' melee lists as well. Now, there's two reasons why I think this. The first reason is because Eldar units, at least their melee units, are extremely cheap. They saw points reductions in the last balanced data slate, even more so, and also their Phoenix Lords, melee ones that is, have also seen points reductions as well. And when I hear players that are struggling against certain armies like Blood Angels, they oftentimes mention the Death Company. So the Death Company are obviously a very powerful unit. They have extreme amounts of melee damage. They get to reroll all their hits, which is crazy. And of course, on top of that, they're typically joined by characters as well who hit very hard. Here's the thing about Death Company though, guys. They're really expensive. They're about double the cost, if not more, than our Aspect Warriors. So for every 5 Death Company Marines, you can probably afford 10 Howling Banshees. And yes, if Death Company charge into 10 Howling Banshees, they're probably going to lose over the course of a couple turns, even with their 6 up Feel No Pain, which isn't nothing, right? So point for point, Howling Banshee should trade up against that unit every time, even if they're charged. And of course, if your opponent is taking an even bigger squad, right, of 10, they're going to be spending upward to 280, maybe even 300 plus points on that unit. It's essentially a big Death Star at that point. So yes, if you're thinking of it in terms of what can 5 Howling Banshees do into a huge unit of Death Company like that, probably not much. But point for point, they are going to trade up, right? If Howling Banshees kill even 3 Death Company Marines, they're already making up their points worth. And that's kind of how you have to think about it. So applying that concept, 1, they're cheaper than a vast majority of the Space Marine equivalents out there, point for point. There's also the fact that a lot of Eldar, combat units, melee units, have fights first, which allows them to fight before the enemy, even if they are charged themselves. Which is pretty insane when you think about it, because Eldar units are already up trading against most Space Marine units out there with the correct matchups. Striking Scorpions aside, there's a few exceptions to that, but everything that does have strike first against those expensive melee units like Death Company are going to be trading up against those units. And especially with the changes to Heroic Intervention, you can easily place a unit of Howling Banshees or the Solitaire within 6 inches of a unit that you know your opponent is going to want to charge into, and then slaughter that unit before they can react. Or at the very least, damage them enough to where they're not going to kill their target. And if you throw Jane Czar into the mix, you can get another heroic intervention in the same phase as well for 0 CP, which is really powerful. So all of a sudden, we're starting to look at something that looks very effective at countering melee armies just from the inclusion of a couple units in our army. However, what if we did it to the whole army itself and made it entirely melee based? Well, as it happens, it's actually pretty effective on the battlefield as well. I ran this a couple days back against a very melee-centric Space Marine army. It wasn't Blood Angels or Space Wolves, granted. I know that's, those are the two armies that are, kind of higher up in the win rate, so to speak, that people are having trouble with. I probably will try to get games against those factions in the future. But, like I said, this build was very melee-centric, had a lot of aggressors in it, had a lot of intercessors in it, so, it was a good field test for the army, and it performed very well, and I was very happy with the results. So yeah, initially, I do think Aeldari armies do have a chance of working in Pariah Nexus. Now, as for the overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be doing a quick rundown of all the Aeldari melee units available in the faction, the strengths and weaknesses of an Aeldari melee list, because there are some weaknesses that you have to be aware of. We're going to be talking about the Ynnari in relation to this, and an example Aeldari melee build with analysis that I ran a couple days ago. Alright, so as for the melee units that are available to the Eldar, we have the Harlequin Troop, which is probably the most popular unit and one of the best in the index. We have Striking Scorpions, also another very strong unit. We have Howling Banshees, Corsairs of both variants, Wraithblades, Shining Spears, the Avatar of Kaner the Yinkarn, and of course our melee characters Jane Czar, Gondrus, the Solitaire, Yvraine, the Vizarch, and the Troopmaster. Now, of course, there are some other units that we have to consider as well, but we're not really going to talk much about them because I've talked so much about them in the past. But essentially, the Autarch Wayleaper, pretty good in combat, not as good as these choices here, but pretty good in his own right. We have things like Prince Riel, who is also pretty good in combat, but, probably not a consideration for most lists. And for units, we see things like Storm Guardians, which, while they look like they're a combat unit, are probably more of a shooting unit, if that. Although they will feature a position in the list that I took. Alright, so starting off with the Troop. The Troop is a hard-hitting unit with powerful fusion pistols and numerous attacks. They get 4 attacks apiece at strength 4 AP -1, which is pretty good as far as the baseline for a weapon goes. They have +1 to wound on charge as well, which allows them to hit harder than most Eldar units in the index. On top of this, they have a 4+ invulnerable save and the grenades keyword, which is really good. We all know how good grenades are for causing damage. However, what makes Quins truly great is that they can be joined by several characters that buff them tremendously. Characters like Yvraine, the Vizarch, and of course the Troopmaster, which we will get into later. Striking Scorpions are next, and they are a unit with devastating wounds and sustained hits. The devastating wounds is not against vehicles and monsters, but it still allows them to punch up against tougher infantry and demolish light infantry. They have infiltrate, so can position up the board very early and get that alpha strike in if you do get the first turn, or just screen for you in general. And of course, Karandras increases their melee damage considerably because he is just an absolute beast. Next, of course, we have Howling Banshees, which are good against high armor units with toughness 4 or less. They have advance and charge with higher movement, so have a big threat range, and they have fights first, which is probably the most important thing to them, which gives them the ability to make attacks before a charging unit does. And this is really only going to come into play when they get charged or when they heroically intervene. So basically when it's your opponent's turn and you will get attacker's priority. And also just a quick PSA for you guys out there who are wondering how fights first works. In the core rules, it does state if a unit has fights first, then it attacks before anything else. Now, a charging unit also gets fights first. However, the inactive player of any turn will get to select which unit fights first. So if your opponent charges into you with fights first because of the charge and you have fights first, you get to choose which unit fights before your opponent does. Now, there is one other thing that you have to watch out for, and that is, of course, counter-offensive, which allows an enemy unit to fight next after one of your units has fought. So this doesn't normally come up, but if you're fighting against a melee army, and they may have, multiple units that are charging in, and you may have multiple fights first units, if you strike first, then your opponent can use 2 command points to basically choose which unit fights next. So that is a little bit of an issue that you do have to consider when, your opponent is using their stratagems and stuff like that. Typically, on the first turn of the game, it's not going to be a big deal because they're only going to have at most 2 command points. And, they're probably not going to want to spend it on that. They're probably going to spend it on their own unique stratagems and stuff like that. But still, it's something you should watch out for. Corsairs are the next unit on the list, and they have a decent combat ability. It's nothing special or out of this world, but it's decent. On charge, they can usually kill a couple of Marines and maybe 1 Marine with the blaster. They do get to also scout, which makes them really good at positioning themselves for a turn 1 charge or reposition, and also just score on objectives. The Void Reavers are the battle line choice, and they get rerolls to hit against enemy units on objectives. And the Void Scarred version is more expensive, but they do get lethal hits and precision against a chosen unit. Typically speaking, you're only going to see Void Reavers, as the Void Scarred are a little bit too expensive for what they can do. Wraithblades are our tough Terminator equivalent infantry. They're extremely durable with the ability to fight on death, a 2-up save, toughness 7, and of course a 4-up invul if you go with the Force Shields. They have strong weapons against Marines, and like I said before, they do have a 4+ invul save if they do take the Force Shields and Ghost Axes. If you choose to go with the Ghost Swords, they do a lot more damage against those types of targets, but the downside is, of course, that they don't get the invul. Wraithblades are pretty good, but they're extremely expensive, and they tend to trade down against a lot of the units that you might see, like Death Company and other units like that. Especially if the Death Company get the charge, Wraithblades are going to have very little chance. Shining Spears are a fast mounted melee unit. They have -1 to hit, basically baked into their profile, and a conditional 4+ invulnerable save when they charge or advance, which make them decently durable. They have good damage against Marines and do decent damage against lighter vehicles as well. The problem with Shining Spears is they have a hard time actually charging with all the ruins and terrain that is set up on the battlefield. The Avatar of Cain and the Yin-Karn are both incredibly tough units that do a high amount of damage. They are indeed combat supremos. Both have good Overwatch and ranged weapons as well, which make them a dual threat. So they can Overwatch units before they come in. The Yin-Karn basically is able to teleport wherever it wants to a destroyed unit on the battlefield, while an Avatar of Cain is tougher and hits much harder. As for the characters, Janzar, Kahandras, the Solitary Yvrain, the Vizark, and the True Master, Kahandras just basically wrecks stuff. He has a bunch of damage boosts when he charges in, and he can basically kill any infantry unit that he wants to. Yvrain makes the unit she joins much tougher, and she does good damage herself with anti-infantry and devastating wound combination, so she's ignoring armor and invuls on infantry. Janzar and the Solitaire are powerful fights first models that can easily wipe charging enemy infantry units out before they can strike. The Vizark gives fights first to his unit and is really effective against Marines himself, and usually he's going to be joining Quins, so fights first Quins are very strong. Of course, and lastly, the Troop Master gives devastating wounds to troops, which is amazing, right? Having devastating wounds on a unit with a lot of attacks is awesome. And it is my opinion that the reason why the Aeldari melee build actually works is because of these characters and the points reductions that we have seen to Aeldari melee units in the last few balanced data slates. Okay, so what are the strengths and weaknesses of an Aeldari melee list? Well, the strengths are, it's fast, it hits really hard for the individual unit cost as well. So if you think about it in terms of what does a unit of 5 do, a lot of people look at that and they're like, oh, you only kill 3 or 4 Marines with a unit of Howling Banshees. That's not that good. But you have to consider that Banshees, again, are only 70 points. And if you're killing 3 or 4 Space Marines in a unit that costs 90 points or more, you are trading up because they're probably not going to be able to kill you back in return. And just to give you a quick example of this, they only have 6 attacks back at you if you end up killing 3 first. So if they're hitting on 3s, they're only hitting 4 times. And if they're wounding on 3s, they're only wounding 3 times, which means they're probably going to kill 2 Banshees, maybe not even that. And of course, that means in your own turn, you are going to be able to, again, fight first. Unless, of course, the enemy unit has fights first, which it probably doesn't, because it's no longer going to be, a unit that charges in. So your Banshees can easily wipe out the rest of them, and you will come out on top. So yes, our melee units, for their cost against their chosen targets, do trade up considerably well. We also have lots of fights first, which makes it hard for other melee units to deal with them, like I've stated before. Those are the main strengths of the Aeldari melee army. The weaknesses, however, are that they are relatively fragile, and they need to be positioned very well for success. They're extremely weak against Overwatch, so you do have to position them well if you do want to get a charge off. And on top of that, just indirect fire is still, even though it's nerfed, is still a threat to a lot of Aeldari melee units. Even though it is a little bit weaker than it was before, it can still easily kill a couple of aspect warriors, and that, of course, can basically make your fight's first unit a little bit less effective. So it is important to note that indirect fire is a weakness, and you do have to play around it. Now, there are a couple of units, of course, that do play around it very well, including things like the Solitaire and the Harlequin Blob with Yvraine. Because, of course, as we know, you get Feel No Pain 5+, and you get to resurrect D3 models in that unit. So indirect fire is very inefficient against that target. Now, I know when it comes to the Ynnari, a lot of you guys are asking questions about their validity as a melee army. And in fact, yes, I think the Ynnari are a very valid melee army indeed. Now, the reason for this is because you have units like Incubi, Archons, and Lilith, which are all very good melee units in a kind of melee type build. Lilith has fights first, which is insane, and she absolutely destroys infantry as well. Incubi are also very good into marine targets. Also, they're much better than Howling Banshees at just killing Space Marines on the charge. Of course, they don't have fights first, so that is a little bit of an issue. The Archon, having the Lord of Deceit ability, is now absolutely brutal against units that rely on stratagem. So you know how I told you before that the counteroffensive stratagem was a really good way to get around the fights first component of the Aeldari army? Well, it turns out if you have an Archon, your opponent can't really do that because it's going to cost 3 command points. So, not only is your opponent rarely going to have the command points for that, but they're probably not going to want to waste 3 CP on something like that. Unless it's, a very particular situation. And of course, Archons aren't that bad in combat themselves. They have anti-infantry 3+, AP -2, and damage 2 on their own weapons. So yes, Ynnari can be very effective as a melee army as well, if not even more effective than an Eldar army themselves. The only weaknesses, of course, here are that you don't get access to things like the Solitaire and the Avatar of Cain. So you do need to be aware of that. Alright, so without further ado, here is an example of an Aeldari melee build that I ran a couple of days ago with some analysis on the unit selection and the strategies involved. Okay, so as for the list itself, this is a basically condensed version of it for all you guys wondering what's in it. We have an Autarch Wayleaper, Jane Czar, Condress, the Solitaire, the Vizar, 2 Troop Masters, a Warlock, Yvraine, Storm Guardians, 3 Falcons, 2 Howling Banshees, 3 Striking Scorpions, and 3 troops, one of which is a huge unit of 12. Now, looking at this list just on the outset, it does have an extremely large amount of characters. And that is probably one weakness I have to look into. However, the characters kind of make this list work, so they're a necessary evil, right? It does make it easy for your opponent to go for Assassinate, but the good news is that if your opponent is going for fixed objectives, you can focus on countering that by playing a little bit more conservatively with some of your characters. The list doesn't also have a lot of vehicles, only 3 Falcons, so it is going to be hard for your opponent to pick up victory points on Bring It Down. And of course, being the Aeldari, your opponent's not going to be able to pick up Call the Horde either. So that other secondary objective that they pick is going to have to be something that is going to be a little more tricky to score. So, of course, this is a Strike Force game, so it'll be 2,000 points. As for the characters, like I said before, we have the Autarch Wayleaper for essentially CP generation, has the Phoenix Gem to make him more durable, and the Howling Banshee Mask to go along with that theme of fights first, because we will have to use heroic intervention throughout the battle as much as possible to save our melee units from getting killed and countercharged. We have Jane Czar on the list, who is crucial, in my opinion, because she gives fights first, but not only that, she allows 2 heroic interventions in your combat phase. So she's a very integral part of the list in defending your own units from getting charged by enemies. Kahandras is just really good. He's just solid damage, which is why I have him in the list. He's with a unit of Striking Scorpions, and they put out enough damage to easily murder a unit of Terminators. With the help of their Falcon transport, of course. The Solitaire is also in here as a great fights first heroic intervention unit. Also, being a lone op, immune to things like indirect fire, immune to enemy shooting for the most part outside of a certain range, and it's a very small model, easy to hide, and good at scoring objectives. We have the Vizarch, who gives fights first to his unit. You guys are probably noticing a theme at this point with fights first, but it is very needed. Especially against the kind of melee armies that we're seeing come out of, Pariah Nexus. They're pretty much all going to try to charge everything they can into you by turn 1 or 2, which means we're going to need as much fights first as possible to make a melee list function correctly. And of course, he also hits very hard, which helps. We also have 2 Troop Masters joined to troop units to give them devastating wounds. This combination out of a Falcon is really good. I was turned on to it a while back, and, this was basically built upon by another channel called Exile Wargaming. Shout out to that channel for basically producing really good Harlequin content. I have an interview coming up with Exile in a couple of days, maybe a week or 2, we'll see. But essentially, his use of these units actually inspired me to do it in this melee build myself because, being able to throw a grenade, tank shock, deal a bunch of mortal wounds, deal a bunch of devastating wounds, is going to be able to take out targets that are much more expensive than the Troop Master and the Harlequins would be. We also do have a Warlock for 45 points. This was something I just had extra points for. It's not necessarily needed, but I put it in a Storm Guardian unit just to see how it did. I figured the -2 to charges and 6-inch advance might be useful for blocking off enemies, screening, getting to objectives to make them sticky, or maybe even just preventing charges. So, I went ahead and threw him in there as well, even though I don't think he's, necessarily needed for the list. I do, of course, also have Yvraine in this list. She is a little bit more expensive, but she's really necessary for that big Harlequin unit to make it more durable, especially to indirect fire and things like that. And also she hits really hard herself against infantry. For our battle line, could we have any other unit except for Storm Guardians? Now, I did mention they're not really a melee unit, but they have swords, so I figured they fit in kind of well, right? They're the quote-unquote melee version of Guardians, so I threw them in here. Mostly, though, again, they're just for sticky objectives, screening, stuff like that. I figured putting the Warlock wouldn't be a bad idea in there as well. It does make them a little more expensive, but also makes them a little bit more, kind of unique in what they can do on the battlefield. For our other data sheets, we have 3 Falcons, and of course we're going to have 2 troops in here for that extra reroll devastating wounds nonsense that the troops are going to be able to give us with the Troop Masters. And we have one filled with Striking Scorpions for essentially the same reason. Rerolling wounds with devastating wounds is going to put a lot of damage on any target we hit. And also, as an added bonus, the Falcons give us that much-needed long-range anti-armor that we, kind of desperately need in any Aeldari list, just because it really does help to be able to whittle down a couple things before the start of the game really gets into it. So, being able to blow up a Rhino early in turn 1 or turn 2 can make all the difference in the long term of the game. So we do have 3 Falcons, Bright Lances, and Pulse Lasers for that. We also have 2 units of Howling Banshees. One unit is with Jane Zar, of course, and that is going to be our countercharge unit, basically positioned in such a way as to where they can heroically intervene when needed, destroying an enemy unit before they get to strike. And then our other unit is simply going to be in reserve, and we're going to be using this in basically a very opportunistic way. We're going to be searching for places to use rapid ingress to put them into the battlefield, into a position where they can either A, score on an objective, or B, charge an enemy unit that is vulnerable. So, essentially, as you guys know, melee armies tend to leave their own backfields wide open, and we're going to use that to our advantage with this unit of Howling Banshees. Because, turn 3 rolls around, if these girls are able to get into a position where they can take an objective away from a small unit of Space Marines guarding an objective, or, contest it from, a basic Rhino or something that your opponent left in the backfield, then that is going to be a very good play for a 70-point unit. Then, of course, we have 3 units of Striking Scorpions. So the other thing about this list is that it does kind of suffer if your opponent gets the first turn and is able to just basically charge their whole army into you turn 1. This makes sure that your opponent cannot charge their entire army into you turn 1, right? 3 units of Scorpions. Now, 1 unit is with Kahandras in the Falcon, but the 2 other units are either going to be screening or looking for opportunities to engage the enemy themselves. Or in a pinch, if they don't have the threat range on enemy units or maybe don't have any good kind of matchups, they can always screen and also perform a secondary objective at the same time. That is a very good use for a 65-point unit as well. Next up, of course, we have the big troop, and this is the 12-player troop, 4 fusion pistols, 4 neurodisruptors, and a bunch of class. This unit is going to be able to rip apart anything in combat, especially with your Yvraine and the Vizark, and it's basically just going to be something your opponent has to ignore or charge something very big into. But again, guess what? Your opponent is not going to be able to kill this unit before they get to attack your opponent first. And especially, I think nowadays, in the past, you could get away with not putting the Vizark in this big unit because, of course, who's going to charge this unit in combat? But now, there's a lot of melee out there that can actually wipe out half the unit or more in a single charge. So my advice to you guys is bring the Vizark, because for 90 points, he's going to be able to save your unit from destruction. And he's actually going to be able to flip the tables on your opponent. And we also in this list do need a big unit that is fairly durable, that can, kind of be on an objective on the side of the battlefield and score us primary points every turn. And this unit will definitely do that against other melee lists. And in fact, in the game I played, my opponent couldn't even touch this unit at all. He charged 1 unit of aggressors into it. The aggressors died horribly, mostly thanks to Yvraine, and then afterward, my opponent ignored it for the rest of the game. 9 out of 10 times, this is exactly what is going to happen into another melee army. If they don't know what this unit does, they're going to blindly charge forward into it. The unit that they charged is going to die horribly, and then they're never going to touch this unit again. And that suits us just fine. Lastly, of course, we do have the 2 troops who will be joined by a true master in order to maximize those devastating wounds and be able to countercharge whatever your opponent throws at you. So, obviously troops, they have a very good threat range, they have high movement, they have high damage, they're a very good combat unit, especially when paired with a Falcon. Okay. So what are my final thoughts on the list? Well, the list, first of all, has a lot of hitting power. I was very surprised at how hard it really hit enemy hard targets. Things with toughness 6, 2-up armor saves, Gravis armor, Terminator armor. My opponent was bringing a very heavy-duty hardcore list against it, and that list just couldn't deal any damage because of all the fights first, heroic intervention, and so forth. And of course, you add that on top of the fact that I was screening units out so that my opponent couldn't charge me all at once and things like this. It just became a very hard prospect for my opponent to deal with. The Falcons, on the other hand, did provide the needed anti-large against targets too tough for our melee units to deal with, and gave a huge damage boost to the troops inside. I think the troops inside, I had 1 squad of 5 with the True Master kill an entire Terminator unit on their own between grenades, their fusion pistols, and their close combat, which was truly insane. I didn't even expect them to do that well myself. My opponent did fail a couple of invul saves that he probably should have made, but even so. Now, as for the possible subs to the list, I think that subbing in the Avatar of Cain would be a good idea for a lot of players out there. And if you don't like Howling Banshees, you can definitely exchange Janzar, both Howling Banshee units, the Warlock, and Scorpions for the Avatar of Cain, and it makes a pretty good, kind of slot in for those exclusions. Or exchanges, I should say. So Avatar of Cain for those units is quite good. It makes your list a lot tougher to deal with. But the downside is you don't have as much fights first. And the Avatar is a liability against certain types of armies, especially those which have grenades, tank shocks, and other things that can deal a lot of mortal wounds. And overall, yeah, I think this list does perform very well. It is very meticulous. You do have to make sure that your units are positioned correctly, especially your screens. Using Storm Guardians as screened actually pretty much won me the game on turn 2 because they were able to screen out 2 units from being able to charge in to multiple Falcons, which was awesome. But I have to say also, my opponent wasn't running the most competitive Space Marine melee build. He wasn't running Space Wolves. He wasn't running Blood Angels. So do take that into consideration as well. He was essentially running an Ultramarines list with a lot of melee units. But of course, he was running the Stormlance task force, so his entire army did have advance and charge. So again, pretty fast army. It was very similar to what you would see in Blood Angels or Space Wolves, just without the special units that those particular armies get, like, Death Company and Thunderwolf Cav. So at the end of the day, though, I was glad to know that this army could at least perform pretty well against a melee build if you're positioned correctly. And again, I am going to have to do some additional testing with this type of army list against some, more competitive builds out there, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, etc. But I do think it has some teeth and definitely a lot of viability into the new meta that we find ourselves in. So in conclusion, basically, with melee armies on the rise, I was wondering if an Eldar melee build would be possible, and it indeed is. Having played one game with the list against a melee-oriented Space Marine build, I can say that it is very effective at preventing both small units of assault intercessors from making a significant impact, and able to dismantle the bigger assault units as well with a combination of devastating wounds and rerolls, which in turn opens up the battlefield quite a bit. And as you guys know, some of the Space Marine special units that I talked about recently got huge point increases. Death Company got points increases. Thunderwolf Cavalry got points increases. Those armies are still very effective, but they're looking a lot smaller. And if we can out-trade them in the melee game, which it is very possible because of how several of our units are costed currently, we can definitely gain the upper hand very quickly. It just takes, again, good positioning, maneuvering, and, the use of things like strikes first to our advantage. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, maybe about either Eldar Melee or, the rising melee armies in Pariah Nexus, and what you have found to be effective. I would really like to hear your thoughts on that. And once again, I would like to thank my patrons and supporters for supporting the channel over the last almost 2 years now. Your help has greatly been appreciated and has helped the channel grow considerably. If you do want to help support the channel, you can always join the channel Patreon. It is free. I have free trials activated, and that will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to check out some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon or some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page, I will leave the links in the description for those also. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.